All right, we're going to talk about the last topic for this semester, and this topic is solving quadratic equations. And we're going to use one method to solve quadratic equations. Now, in other classes, you may talk about other methods, but for us right now, the one method we're going to talk about is by factoring. So solving quadratic equations by factoring. All right, so let's talk about what a quadratic equation is. A quadratic equation is an equation of the form x, let's say ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So basically, we have an x squared term. So I'm going to say, notice there is an x squared term. Now, this is different than a linear equation. We've had a linear equation before. That's something like 4x plus 3x minus 10 equals 11. That's a linear equation. We've only had, or when we talk about linear, or when we have linear equations, we only have an x term. We don't have anything that says x squared. Okay? So this is a linear equation. Now we can solve a linear equation by saying 4x plus 3x, well, that's 7x, minus 10 equals 11. If I add 10 to both sides, I'm going to get 7x is equal to 11 plus 10 is 21, and if I divide by 7, I'm going to get x is equal to 3. So I get one solution. Sometimes I have no solution. Sometimes I have infinitely many solutions, and all real numbers then are the solution in that case. That's a linear equation. How is a quadratic equation different? Well, let's take a look at one. If I have x squared plus 7x plus 6 equals 0. Let me look at this x squared and 7x. Now, in the previous example, I was able to get x by itself. Even though there were two x's in the equation, I could get them together because I had like terms. So then it was easy to get x by itself. That's one of the things that we want to do when we solve a linear equation. Can't use that technique in this case because x squared and x are two different terms. These are unlike terms, so I can't put them together. So in this case, I'm never going to be able to get x by itself. So we never will get x by itself. So we need another way, okay? And if you notice x squared plus 7x plus 6, that looks like something that can be factored. That looks like something that we might want to factor, okay? So we're going to try to use factoring. We also have to use something called the zero product property, and we'll talk about that right now. So the zero product property, it says that if I have two things multiplied by each other and the result is 0, then either the first thing or the second thing has to be 0. So it says if you have A times B and the product is 0, then either A has to be 0 or B has to be 0. That makes a lot of sense, right? If I multiply a number by 3 and it comes out 0, that number has to be 0, right? So if I multiply two numbers together and the product is 0, one of those have to be 0, okay? So the idea is, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the equation. We're going to make sure that we can get an expression equal to 0. So we're going to ensure one side of the equation is equal to 0. We're going to factor the non-zero side, and we're going to use this zero product property to break up the factors and set one of them equal to 0 and the other equal to 0. And the other one, if we have more than 3 factor, or more than 2 factors, I'm sorry, and then we're going to solve in each case. So let's write that down, and then we'll do an example as we write it down, okay? So basically, to solve a quadratic equation, by factoring, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to ensure one side of the equation is equal to 0. So ensure one side is equal to 0. So in our case, that's already been done for us. I already have x squared plus 7x plus 6 equals 0. Now, since I have something equals 0, I'm going to factor this non-zero side and see if I can apply the zero product property. Okay? So the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor the non-zero side. Okay? So in this case, let's look at x squared plus 7x plus 6. I don't have anything in common. I don't have 4 terms. It is a trinomial, and I don't have a number other than 1 in front of x squared. So I'm going to factor this by just simply writing x and x in parentheses and filling in the blanks. So x and x, two numbers that when I multiply them together I get 6, but when I add them together I get 7. That seems pretty obvious. A positive 6 and a positive 1. 6 times 1 is 6. 6 plus 1 is 7. Now remember, this is set equal to 0. Can we use the zero product property to solve? Yes, we can, because if I have a times b and it's equal to 0, then one of these factors has to be equal to 0. I have 2 factors. Remember, these are 2 factors. They multiply to give me x squared plus 7x plus 6. So these two things are multiplied together and the result is 0. So that means that either the first expression, x plus 6, is equal to 0, or the second expression, x plus 1, is equal to 0. Okay? So what we did there was we set each factor equal to 0. And then the fourth thing we're going to do is we're just going to solve. So I have x plus 6 equals 0. If I want to get rid of 6 from this side, I subtract it. So I have x equals negative 6. Here I have x plus 1 equals 0. If I want to get rid of 1, I'm going to subtract it. So here I have x equals negative 1. So the answer is x equals negative 6 or x equals negative 1. And quadratic equations will most often have 2 answers. Sometimes it'll be a repeated answer, but most often they'll have 2 answers. And a neat little trick you can use is that the highest exponent that you have in an equation, usually tells you how many answers you're going to have. So I have the highest exponent of 2, so I have 2 answers. If I have the highest exponent being 3, then I will probably have 3 answers, but that wouldn't be a quadratic equation. A quadratic equation can only have an x squared and an x. So x squared has to be the highest exponent in a quadratic equation. All right, how does that sound? Does that sound okay? All right, so keep these in mind as we take a look at a couple other equations. All right, let's take a look at a couple other equations. Let's look at this equation. What if I have x squared minus 6x equals 0? Okay, the first thing I have to do is I have to ensure that I have one side of the equation being 0. I do. Right here is 0. I've got it right here. So I'm okay. Then I'm going to factor the non-zero side. When I look at x squared minus 6x, what's the first thing that you notice? That's right, you should have noticed that I have a common factor. I have a common factor of x. So I'm going to factor out that x. So I have x times, and in parentheses, if I have x squared, I take one x away, I'm left with 1x. So x minus, and if I have 6x and I take x away, I'm left with just 6. So x minus 6, and that's equal to 0. Okay? So I have two factors, x and x minus 6. I need to set each of those factors equal to 0. So x equals 0, and x minus 6 equals 0. Well, x equals 0 is not a hard equation to solve. It's actually pretty easy to solve because x equals 0, that's it. But we actually need to do a step here. I have x minus 6 equals 0, so I'm going to add 6 to both sides. And then I'm going to get x is equal to positive 6. And that's my second answer. I had x squared, so I should have gotten 2 answers. What do you think? All right, let's look at another one. What if we wanted to look at 9x squared equals 4? All right. The first thing I have to do is I have to ensure that the equation is equal to 0, or that one side of the equation is 0. I don't have this in this case. So what I'm going to do is I notice that I have this 4 over here. If I subtract 4 from both sides, second, let me erase that. That was not a very good 4. So if I subtract 4 from both sides, on this side I'm going to get 4 minus 4 is 0. Good, that's what I want. And on this side I'm going to get 9x squared minus 4. Alright? So 9x squared minus 4 equals 0. What do you notice about 9x squared minus 4? Well, it's not, there's not anything in common. I don't have 4 terms. It's not a trinomial. It's a binomial. So let me see if this is a difference of squares. Well, it's a difference. That's good. And then 9 minus 4, or 9x squared and 4, basically are perfect squares. 9x squared is a perfect square. What do I have to square to get 9x squared? 3x. And 4 is a perfect square. What do I have to square to get 4? 2. So I'm going to take 3x plus 2 and multiply that by 3x minus 2. And I still have those equal to 0. Now, I have the zero product property that I can use to say 3x plus 2 equals 0, 3x minus 2 equals 0, and now I'm going to solve. Solve for x in each case. So if I subtract 2 from both sides, then I'm going to have 3x is equal to negative 2. And if I divide by 3, I'm going to have x is equal to negative 2/3. So that's one answer. If I add 2 to both sides, then I'm going to have 3x is equal to 2. And if I divide by 3, I'm going to have x is equal to 2/3. That's a good lot of work there, but it's not so bad. None of the calculations are that difficult, but there are plenty things to do. So what do you think? Not so bad or horrible? Not so bad. All right, let's look at another one. What if I have 3x squared minus 7x equals 20? All right, well, it's not solved for 0, or one of the sides of the equation is not 0, so I need to make it 0. How about we subtract 20 from both sides? So I have 3x squared minus 7x minus 20. And that's going to be equal to 0. All right, now let's look at 3x squared minus 7x minus 20. In this case, I have that second version of a trinomial where I have a number in front of x squared. So let's try to z-box this. I've got 3x squared, negative 20 on top, negative 7x on the bottom. All right, let's see. I think I can break 3x squared up by saying 3x and x. And then how can I break up 20, negative 20? Maybe negative 4 and 5. So negative 3 times negative 4 is negative 12x. 3x and negative 4 is negative 12x. And x times 5 is 5x. And negative 12 plus 5 is it negative 7? Yeah. So there we go. That's what we want to use. All right, if we remember, our diagonals are the binomials. So 3x and a positive 5, or 3x plus 5. And x minus 4. And that should be equal to 0. Okay, now when I look at this, I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. So 3x plus 5 equals 0. X minus 4 equals 0. And I'm going to solve. I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. And let me cut this off here. So I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. I'm going to get negative 5 on this side equals, that goes away, and I'm left with just 3x. So I have 3x equals negative 5. If I divide by 3, I'm going to say x is negative 5/3. All right, now over here I'm just going to add 4 to both sides. So that goes away here, and I'm going to just have x is equal to positive 4. So negative 5/3 and positive 4, those are both solutions to this equation. What that means, if I were to put in negative 5/3 for 3 in for x and 3x squared minus 7x minus 20, I'd get 0. And if I were to put 4 in there, I'd also get 0. All right, let's look at one last polynomial equation, quadratic equation together, and then I'll let you work on some on your own. So what if I have 6x squared minus 4x equals 10? All right, so the first thing I need to do is I need to factor, or not factor, ensure that one side is equal to 0. So one side's not 0 now, so I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. That way I'm going to get 6x squared minus 4x minus 10 equals 0. Now I've got to solve. So I'm going to factor, or I guess the next step when I'm solving, I've been solving all along, but the next step is to factor the non-zero side. So 6, 4, and 10, those all have a common factor of 2. So I'm going to factor a 2 out first. So I have 2 times 3x squared minus 2x minus 5. And that equals 0. Okay, one of the cool tricks we can use is that anytime we have a number sitting outside of parentheses, not when we have a variable, but when we have a number sitting outside parentheses, we can use this cool trick of just dividing everything by that number. Okay? Now, when I do that, 2 and 2 is going to cancel out over here, and I'm going to be left with just 3x squared minus 2x minus 5. Okay? And then 0 divided by 2 is just 0. 0 divided by anything is just 0. So I've eliminated that factor of 2, and it's going to make my equation a little easier to solve because I'm not going to be dealing with such big numbers. But let's see if we can factor this now. Probably going to need the z box because I have that 3 in front of the x squared. So let's go on to another slide. Alright, so we have 3x squared minus 2x minus 5 equals 0. Let's try to factor this. And I'm going to be using the z box to factor. So if I have 3x squared and negative 5 on top, and I have negative 2x on the bottom. Alright, so I can break 3x squared up into 3x and x, and I can break negative 5 up into negative 5 times 1. Well, 3x times negative 5 is negative 15x, and x times 1 is 1x. That's not going to be negative 2 when I add those together, so I might need to try something else. So let's try something else. I'm going to leave 3x and x alone for right now. Let's switch around negative 5 and 1. So I'm going to put negative 5 down here, and I'm going to put 1 up here. So 3x times 1 is 3x. And x times negative 5 is negative 5x. 3 minus 5 is negative 2. So these are my binomials. 3x minus 5 and x plus 1. Those are equal to 0. So I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. If the product is equal to 0, that means one of the factors must be 0. So let's find out what will make the factors be 0. So if I add 5 to both sides here, I'm going to end up with 3x is equal to 5. And if I divide by 3, I'm going to have x is equal to 5/3. It's one of my answers. In this case, if I subtract 1, then I'm just going to have x is equal to 1. And that's negative 1, I'm sorry. That's my second answer. So the answer is 5/3 or negative 1. Okay, now I'm going to let you try to factor or solve, excuse me, some quadratic equations by factoring. So what if I ask you to solve each of these equations? X squared minus 6x equals, oh, I'm sorry, not equals. Let me get rid of that. Plus x squared minus 6x plus 5 equals 0. Let's also look at x squared plus 8x equals 0. Let's look at 4x squared equals 25. And let's also look at 2y squared plus 12y equals negative 10. Go ahead and factor those, or solve those. I don't know why I keep saying factor. Go ahead and solve those. Pause the video, and then when you're done solving, unpause and we'll look at them together. Alright, if you're not finished, pause the video and finish factoring on your own. I really want you to try these on your own. Not factoring, solving. I don't know why I keep saying factoring. I guess it's because you're solving by factoring. But we're really solving, that's the main thing, not just factoring in this case, so I should start saying solving. But anyway, let's solve. X squared minus 6x plus 5. One side of the equation is 0, so I don't have to worry about that. So I'm just going to factor and use the zero product property. This is a trinomial where I do not have a number other than 1 in front of x squared, so I'm going to use writing x and x in parentheses and filling in the blanks. So, two numbers that when I multiply them together, I get 5, but when I add them together, I get negative 6. How about negative 1 and negative 5? Negative 1 times negative 5 is positive 5, and negative 1 plus negative 5 is negative 6. So those are my two factors. So I'm going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So if I solve in this case, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. That 1 goes away, and I'm left with x is equal to 1. And here I'm going to add 5 to both sides. So this goes away, and I have x is equal to 5. So x is equal to 1, and x is equal to 5. Good. Alright, let's also look at x squared plus 8x equals 0. When I look at this one, I notice that I have to factor out a common factor. So I'm going to factor out an x, and that'll leave me with x plus 8 equals 0. So x equals 0, and x plus 8 equals 0. Actually, I don't need those parentheses there. Alright, this one's easy. X equals 0 is already solved for us. And x plus 8 equals 0, I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. So I have x equals 0. Alright, let's move on. 4x squared equals 25. What is the first thing I have to do here? That's right, I have to get 0 on one side of the equation. So I think I'm going to do that by subtracting 25 from both sides. So when I do that, I'm going to get 4x squared minus 25 is equal to 0. I look at 4x squared and I look at 25 and I notice those are two perfect squares. There's a difference in the middle. We have a difference of squares. So I'm going to factor this by finding the square root of each. What do I have to square to get 4x squared? Well, that's just 2x. What do I have to square to get 25? That's 5. So I have 2x plus 5 and 2x minus 5 equal to 0. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. It's going to get a little tight in here. So if I subtract 5 from both sides here, I'm going to have 2x equals negative 5. And if I divide by 2, I'm going to have, in this case, x equals negative 5 over 2. I hope you can see that. And I'm going to come over here and work this one out. So if I have 2x plus 5 equals 0, uh-oh, this one shouldn't be a plus. I probably said minus, but I wrote plus. Let's see, this should be minus, right? Because this first one was plus, so this one should be minus. I got it right up here, but I didn't. I made a mistake when I wrote it down below. Okay, so I'm going to add 5 then to both sides. So 2x equals 5, and if I divide by 2, x in this case is going to be equal to 5 halves. So x equals 5 halves, x equals negative 5 halves. And you'll notice that if the polynomial in the quadratic equation is actually a difference of squares, 9 times out of 10 your products will be, or the solutions, not the products, the solutions will be opposites. Okay? All right, let's look at 2y squared plus 12y equals negative 10. What am I going to do first? I have to get 0 on one side, so I'm going to do that by adding 10 to both sides. So really what I have is 2y squared plus 12y plus 10 equals 0. Now I notice that 2, 12, and 10 all have the same factor of 2. So I'm going to take a 2 out. I'm going to have y squared plus 6y plus 5 equals 0. I can divide by 2, and y squared plus 6y plus 5 equals 0 is what I have left. Well, isn't that the same as our first x squared minus 6x plus 5? No, it's not the same. Sorry, it's not the same. I've got plus and plus. So let's see how I can factor this. I can factor this by saying y and y in parentheses and by filling in the blanks. Because there's no number in front of y squared, we factored it out with that 2. And then 5 times 1 is 5, and 5 plus 1 is 6. So it's a positive 1 and a positive 5. So if I have y plus 1 times y plus 5, and that's equal to 0, I'm going to set each factor equal to 0, and I'm going to solve. So y, if I want to solve this first equation, I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides, so I have y equals negative 1. And if I want to solve this equation, I subtract 5 from both sides, so I have y equals negative 5. So negative 1 or negative 5. All right. I hope that you found this helpful.